Before this video starts, I want to point out that this is a response to the Folded Ideas video, Why It's Rude to Suck at Warcraft. Not a rebuttal or even a critique. Their video is excellent and raises a lot of good points. If somehow you managed to find your way to this video without watching Folded Ideas first, there's a link to it in the description below. I strongly recommend that you see that first, as I only have a few things to add about my personal experience. I should say before I get started that almost everything I heard in the Folded Ideas video rang true. I can't speak for every detail, but I never once heard something I didn't agree with. I can say that things like DPS meters and add-ons have achieved near saturation levels. My guild is not amazing, and never intended to be. We did not complete any of the raids on heroic difficulty. Yet nearly everyone in the raid team routinely needs to download and update popular add-ons like Deadly Boss Mods and Decursive. When raiding began in the early days of Warcraft, encounters were far more direct. Ragnaros was the big raid boss of Vanilla, and his special moves were hit very hard with hammer and summon elementals. That's an easy dungeon boss now. When each raid boss has between 5 and 20 different abilities, often in multiple stages, some of which kill other players if you screw up, I can understand if maybe did I cast that last spell or not is the top priority in everyone's mind. So nearly everyone in my guild raid group uses add-ons to keep things going smoothly. Nearly. I don't. My guild and other people I've run with know me as the guy who doesn't use add-ons, and often they're surprised at how well I do. I don't say that out of arrogance. Well, not completely, but many players are so used to everyone using additional help anymore, and it's very rare they find someone who doesn't. I'm not a great player, or at the very minimum, I've never put myself in a situation where I'd find out if I was great or not, but I have taken every necessary step to make sure I was at least competent. I've sometimes thought of players who could only play because they had add-ons as not really playing, but the Folded Ideas video and some 2020 hindsight have me rethinking that. Is it really that different than letting a Calculus 2 student use a trig cheat sheet when they are, I counted, 72 different trig things they're supposed to have on hand? So maybe I was more than a little judgmental. That said, I can safely say that anyone really focused on one class, one spec, and one encounter at a time should really be able to do their job, or, as the video says, they're being rude to the other players. How they step up to that challenge can vary from player to player, but in my experience, it doesn't vary much. I'm the outlier, the stubborn, arrogant outlier. When World of Warcraft first launched, dungeons and raid difficulties weren't really a thing that existed. All dungeons had a set level, which wasn't always maximum. Raids famously took a full team of 40 people, but there was no normal versus heroic. By the time the Lich King expansion happened, this had expanded. Dungeons had 2 settings, regular and heroic. Raids had as many as 4, normal and heroic for each 10 and 25 people. Things continued to develop until the current situation. At time of writing, dungeons can be run in normal mode, adapting their level to the levels of the 5 players involved, which don't have to all be the same. And they could be run in heroic, which was always maximum level. Or they could be run on Mythic or Mythic Plus, which had increased scaling and additional difficulty additions, effectively allowing them to have an indefinite level of challenge. Raids had 4 difficulties, up from 3 quite recently, and there are tools that allow individuals or groups to find a dungeon or raid of the difficulty that they want. The hardest difficulty of both dungeons and raids that you've run on your character is not a secret. People putting a dungeon or raid together can see if you've done this sort of thing before. Some players will take pity on a lower level player and carry them. Others, and there's a lot of confirmation bias on this one, ask for unreasonably high requirements because they want proof that the people they're running with are strong or exceptional, or they're looking for a carry themselves. It can feel at times like you're asked if you have a 6-figure salary just because you're buying a bicycle.
Big mistake. Big. Huge.
In the end, what matters is that these difficulties exist at all. It's been the case for the last few expansions that the final raid drops 8 to 12 months before the expansion ends, meaning most of the player base has nothing new to do for some time, other than, well, try stronger and stronger versions of the same content. It's similar to what the Folding Ideas video said about speedrunning in most respects, in that it's an increasing difficulty, but it's less sprinting and more mountain climbing. Another big change over the years of World of Warcraft is the amount of obstacles placed between you and another style of play. With the rise of DPS meters and add-ons that can handle even complex class abilities, it was possible to not just find which class, spec, and gear would be best against a wooden post standing there doing nothing, but in each raid or even each boss in each raid. There's a bit of a mantra, bring the player, not the class, which hasn't always been repeated earnestly. When you have objective proof that, for example, arms warriors do more damage than fury warriors, asking the warrior to swap specs wasn't going to fly in vanilla. But by Miss of Pandaria, it became possible. Players could hold multiple specs, and the issue was only if they had the right gear for both. Right now, not only can any player access all the specs their class has, but they can also swap out every single talent they have without cost in any safe zone, or even in a dungeon or raid with only a mild cost. Players also feel more expected to have multiple characters, so they can swap classes if called for. Advancing a new character is faster than it's ever been, with boosts available to instantly max out a single character, and even give them half-decent armor and weapons. If a raid group wants to run a raid and there's only 2 healers online, they normally wouldn't get very far, but now the expectation is that one of the damage dealers swaps either their spec or even their entire character to their healer, or one of their healers. Switching the topic back to me again, just like I'm the guy who doesn't run add-ons, I'm also the guy who doesn't have alts. And even I have, a few, but in this context too. It's just easier to be self-reliant or gather more materials when you have access to a character strong enough to do that. I know basically nothing about using either of them effectively, but the mechanics for catch-up gear keep getting added every few months for players who didn't just have alts but the desire to use them. One of the things Folding Ideas mentioned was that the game is beautiful, and it is. One of the things they didn't mention was the story. Here's where it gets a little awkward. When World of Warcraft first launched, there, wasn't really a story at all, or at least not one that stuck with players. Most zones were separated hubs with minimal connection to each other. There was a standard progression line that you followed because the zones were escalating in level, but it was rare that anyone in, say, Ashenvale sent you to Fairless or vice versa. This was updated later in the Cataclysm expansion, but that's how it was at launch. Meanwhile, following expansions also often gave the players the ability to explore that expansion's zones in the order they saw fit, even adding level scaling to help with that. The final, hardest zone could be separated out from this list, but that'd be about it. Shadowlands decided they wanted to try a more uniform narrative, which meant their zones went in order. You would enter them all first, you would go to Bastion second, you would do Revan Death last, and only then would you move on from there. From a storytelling perspective, this makes sense. It's a lot easier to tell either one long or 4 shorter but connected stories, and create a solid world-building narrative than to have a choose-your-own-adventure of 4 small stories that could be done in whatever order you wanted. Previous expansions hadn't really done this very well. Wrath of the Lich King came closest, but even then, the issue was that the Alliance and Horde had different starting zones and were supposed to meet in the middle. However, other than that, the story was followable, aided by significant lore history of Arthas the Lich King, who'd made appearances in other Warcraft games. Shadowlands didn't have that. The story of Shadowlands was based on a previously never-mentioned jailer who, it turns out, was the mastermind behind the last few expansion packs, engineering as much death and destruction as possible. It hinged around the 2 leaders of both factions doing his bidding. Anduin, leader of the Alliance, given the same corrupted treatment as so many other villains, and Sylvanas, leader of the Horde, actively working for him because she was tricked, basically meaning that neither one was responsible for their actions, both being able to seek forgiveness. It sounded to many people like retconning to the point of Blofeld and Spectre. The idea of World of Warcraft heroes being so strong they're able to enter heaven and hell directly and challenge the residents therein never sat well with me. I get that any advancing game needs to raise the stakes, and in the previous expansion pack, we saved the planet from a wound stabbed in it by a titan in the one before that. but there's not many places you can go when you've kicked down Satan's door and 25 manned him to death. The only other thing I want to mention is that World of Warcraft has gone out of their way to give collectors like myself something to do. Like I said, I'm not an amazing player, but there's an extensive list of achievements, pets, and mounts I've gone out of my way to collect in a Mount Everest because it's there situation. I don't know where to find a leaderboard for that sort of thing, but I'd strongly suspect I have more achievements, pets, and mounts than like 90% of all players, because most players don't find hunting them fun or interesting. I'd more hesitantly guess I have slightly above average than most collectors, but mostly because I've been playing for so long. As mentioned before, when you have nothing but the same content for most of a year before the next expansion launches, you have to find your own fun. In Warcraft, I don't sprint and I don't climb mountains. I go hunting. I enjoy it. Warcraft keeps me playing because they have something I enjoy. Achievements are basically bragging rights, and you never need more than 2 mounts. Pets do actually have some gameplay value, but I will defend to the death my view that they're trying to steal from Pokemon. But pet battles and their rock, paper, scissors, turn-based combat gameplay do serve as a nice change of pace from time to time, so having a few is worthwhile. Having 1,000 is overkill. So there you go. I hope that explains my perspective on the subject. Thanks to Folded Ideas for their video in the first place, and thank you everyone who took the time to stop by and listen to mine as well.